November 24th, 1326. In the ancient market town of Hereford, a massive crowd had gathered, their collective breath hanging like frost in the chill autumn air. They were there not for a festival or a royal procession, but for a spectacle of profound and devastating cruelty, a public act of vengeance that would scar the memory of an entire generation. Hugh Despenser the Younger, once the undisputed favorite of King Edward II, was to be executed. His crime, in the eyes of the vengeful Queen Isabella and her ally Roger Mortimer, was not merely treason against the realm, but a deeper, almost blasphemous treason against the natural order, stemming from an unnatural love for a king that had led to the ruination of England and the alienation of its people. The gallows, constructed with grim efficiency, stood tall, a stark monument to the fragility of power and the terrifying consequences of its abuse. The air hummed with a tension that was part anticipation, part morbid curiosity, and part a chilling sense of catharsis, as the masses prepared to witness the systematic dismantling of a man who had held absolute sway over their monarch and their land. This was not a swift, clean death. It was a ritualistic dismemberment, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to inspire terror and ensure that no one would ever dare to emulate the audacious, almost reckless ambition of the man soon to be brought before them. The moment was ripe with historical gravity, a visceral manifestation of a kingdom's outrage, and a stark reminder that even the most cherished bonds could be severed with the cold blade of political necessity and the brutal force of collective fury. To understand why a man might face such an abhorrent end, we must rewind the relentless clock of history to the very origins of Hugh Despenser the Younger. Born into a formidable and ambitious aristocratic family, his lineage was already deeply entangled with the machinations of English court life. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had been a veteran of royal service, accumulating lands and influence under Edward I, setting a formidable precedent for his son's future. Young Hugh, possessing a keen intellect and an undeniable charm, inherited not only his family's considerable estates, but also their inherent grasp of political maneuvering, a trait that would prove both his making and his undoing. He began his public life in the shadow of his powerful father, serving with distinction in various military campaigns and gaining experience in the complex legal and administrative systems of the era. His marriage to Eleanor de Clare, a niece of King Edward II himself, and co-heiress to the vast Gloucester estates, marked a pivotal moment in his ascent. This union not only brought him immense wealth and land, but also solidified his direct familial link to the royal family, granting him a proximity to power that few could boast. Yet beyond the calculated acquisitions of wealth and status lay a deeper, more profound ambition, an almost insatiable hunger for control that drove him relentlessly forward. He was not content with mere influence. He sought to wield the very levers of governance, to reshape the kingdom according to his own vision, a vision that, tragically, often blurred the lines between the welfare of the realm and the ruthless pursuit of personal gain. This early life, seemingly conventional for a man of his standing, was in fact a meticulous apprenticeship in the dark arts of courtly politics, preparing him for a role far grander and far more perilous than anyone, perhaps even he himself, could have foreseen. But to grasp the weight of this moment, we must turn our attention to the sovereign himself, King Edward II, a figure whose reign was defined by personal attachments and profound political misjudgment. Edward, unlike his formidable warrior father, possessed a temperament ill-suited to the demands of medieval kingship. He shunned the martial prowess expected of a monarch, preferring the company of intimate male friends and indulging in pursuits deemed undignified by his barons. This perceived weakness, coupled with his almost obsessive reliance on favorites, created a dangerous vacuum at the heart of power. The execution of Piers Gaveston, Edward's first powerful favorite by the enraged nobility, had left a gaping wound in the king's psyche and a void in his affections. It was into this perilous space that Hugh Despenser the Younger, with his sharp mind and calculating charm, meticulously inserted himself. Their bond, which quickly escalated beyond mere political alliance into a passionate, all-consuming intimacy, became the defining characteristic of Edward's later reign. Despenser rapidly consolidated his position, pushing aside rivals, seizing lands and titles, and effectively becoming the de facto ruler of England. The king, seemingly enthralled and emotionally dependent, granted Despenser unprecedented authority, allowing him to dictate policy, appoint officials, and even influence the royal finances to an astonishing degree. This was not merely a case of a king elevating a loyal servant. It was the creation of a shadow monarchy, where Despenser's will became, for all intents and purposes, the will of the crown. The implications were immediate and devastating, as the court and kingdom watched with growing apprehension, sensing that the very fabric of governance was being unraveled by a singular, unchecked obsession, a love that would ultimately consume both the beloved and the lover. Yet something went wrong. The meteoric ascent of Hugh Despenser, fueled by the king's singular devotion, was matched only by the swift accumulation of universal resentment. Despenser's avarice knew no bounds, manifesting in a relentless campaign of land acquisition, often through highly questionable or overtly illegal means. He systematically dispossessed rivals, manipulated the legal system to his advantage, and openly defied traditional feudal customs, viewing the entire kingdom as a personal inheritance to be exploited. His arrogance was legendary, his contempt for the established nobility palpable, and his pursuit of wealth and power utterly ruthless. He stripped nobles of their rightful inheritances, engineered false charges to seize their estates, and even encroached upon the traditional rights of the queen herself, a deeply unwise and ultimately fatal error. The chronicles of the time are replete with tales of his outrageous extortions and the widespread fear he inspired. The barons, already chafing under Edward II's perceived weakness and his previous favoritism towards Gaveston, found Despenser's tyranny unbearable. He had become not merely a powerful figure, but a monstrous embodiment of royal corruption, an unchecked cancer on the body politic. The sheer audacity of his greed and the unyielding nature of his control over the king transformed smoldering discontent into open rebellion. This was not an isolated incident of court intrigue. It was a profound systemic crisis, an illustration of how unchecked power, once given a foothold, can metastasize into an existential threat to the very stability of the realm. The seeds of his own destruction, ironically, were sown by the boundless extent of his unbridled ambition and the devastating vulnerability of the crown he so eagerly exploited. The growing outrage against the Despensers, both father and son, found its most potent and unexpected champion in Queen Isabella, the neglected and increasingly desperate wife of Edward II. Isabella, a formidable woman by birth, the daughter of King Philip IV of France, known as the Fair, had endured years of humiliation and financial hardship at the English court. Her husband's obsessive devotion to Hugh Despenser had not only alienated her emotionally, but also directly attacked her dower lands and political influence, leaving her stripped of dignity and power. This was no ordinary marital dispute. It was a profound political conflict, where the queen's very survival and status were threatened by the king's favorite. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. It was there, amidst the relative freedom of the French court, that her transformation began. She refused to return to England, publicly stating that she would not live with her husband, while Despenser remained his chief counselor. Her defiance escalated when she formed a scandalous yet politically astute alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord who had been exiled by Edward II and the Despensers. Together, Isabella and Mortimer became the nucleus of a burgeoning rebellion, their shared grievances uniting a disparate group of English exiles, disaffected nobles, and foreign mercenaries. The very system meant to protect Isabella had become her tormentor, forcing her to seek justice, or rather vengeance, by extraordinary means. This audacious alliance, built upon a foundation of mutual suffering and a shared desire for retribution, would ultimately change the course of English history, leading an exiled queen to launch an invasion of her own husband's kingdom, a testament to the profound damage wrought by the Despensers' overreach. The invasion itself, when it finally materialized in the late summer of 1326, was swift and shockingly effective, revealing the profound instability that had festered beneath the surface of Edward II's reign. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer landed with a relatively small force at Orwell on the Suffolk coast, but their numbers swelled almost immediately, as disgruntled nobles, alienated clergy, and a populace weary of Despenser's tyranny flocked to their banner. The public's complicity in the impending downfall of the regime was evident in the speed with which support for the Queen escalated, a stark contrast to the king's inability to rally any significant loyalist forces. Edward II, paralyzed by indecision, and perhaps by the depth of his emotional dependence on Despenser, found his authority crumbling around him with terrifying rapidity. His attempts to raise an army were futile. Even London, traditionally a royalist stronghold, rose up in open revolt, hanging the Bishop of Exeter, a Despenser ally, and seizing the Tower. The royal couple, Hugh Despenser and King Edward, were forced to flee, abandoning London for the perceived safety of the Welsh marches, the very region where Despenser had amassed much of his disputed wealth. Their flight was not a strategic retreat, but a panicked scramble, a desperate attempt to outrun the tide of popular fury that they themselves had unleashed. The speed of the collapse was devastating, a stark illustration of how completely the king had lost the trust and loyalty of his subjects, and how utterly vulnerable he became once his favorite's protective, yet ultimately destructive grip began to loosen. The reign, once seemingly unshakable, disintegrated into chaos, leaving a vacuum ripe for the vengeful reshaping of power. The capture of Hugh Despenser the Younger, following a desperate and futile flight across a kingdom turned hostile, marked the true beginning of his ultimate brutal reckoning. He and the king were finally apprehended in South Wales, attempting to escape by sea, only to be forced back by adverse winds and an unyielding pursuit. The sight of the captured king and his hated favorite brought a wave of exultation to the pursuing forces, and a profound sense of closure to a kingdom that had endured years of their oppressive rule. Despenser was immediately brought before a makeshift court at Hereford, presided over by Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer. But this was no impartial legal proceeding. It was a carefully choreographed spectacle of vengeance, a public performance designed to ratify his perceived guilt and justify the extreme measures that would be taken against him. The charges hurled at him were numerous and damning: treason, extortion, corruption, a long litany of abuses that had bled the kingdom dry. He was denied the right to speak in his own defense, his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears, drowned out by the roar of the assembled crowd and the unforgiving judgment of his accusers. The very system meant to protect him had become his executioner, and the justice it dispensed was swift, merciless, and designed to send an unmistakable message. It was not justice in the abstract sense, but retribution in its rawest, most visceral form, a warning etched in blood for any who might dare to challenge the new order or to overstep the bounds of proper conduct. The sentence, when it was pronounced, was the most brutal and public form of death imaginable, a final, definitive declaration of his utter condemnation. And so we return to Hereford, to the crisp autumn air of November 24th, 1326, where the full horror of Hugh Despenser's punishment was brought to bear. The execution was not merely a means to an end, it was a deliberate, drawn-out act of public terror, a ceremonial unleashing of collective outrage. He was dragged through the muddy streets to the gallows, taunted by the very populace he had once so contemptuously ruled. The initial act, hanging, was a grim prelude, though he was cut down before the point of death, ensuring he remained conscious for the escalating torment. What followed was a demonstration of the era's capacity for extreme brutality. He was subjected to public emasculation, his genitals severed and thrown into a waiting fire, a grotesque symbolic punishment for what was perceived as his unnatural influence over the king and his subversion of the proper order. Then came the drawing and quartering, a process of unimaginable cruelty where his bowels were removed and burned before his still living eyes, and his limbs eventually torn from his body by 4 horses, each pulling in a different direction. His screams, if the chronicles are to be believed, echoed across the market square, a devastating sound absorbed by the grim satisfaction of the crowd, who had become complicit witnesses to this ultimate degradation. The sheer theatricality of the event, the agonizing slowness of the process, was designed to maximize suffering and to engrave the lesson of Despenser's downfall into the very psyche of the kingdom. It was an act of profound barbarism, yet one understood by many as a necessary, even righteous cleansing of the realm from the cancerous influence that had almost consumed it. His suffering was a public ritual, a sacrifice not to justice but to the overwhelming need for a symbolic purge, leaving a haunted legacy. The demise of Hugh Despenser, so spectacularly violent and public, was merely the first domino to fall in a dramatic reshaping of the English throne. The king, Edward II, remained in the custody of Isabella and Mortimer, his fate sealed by the depth of his perceived weakness and his unwavering, albeit now futile, attachment to his favorite. Deposed in January 1327, a monarch was, for the first time in centuries, formally stripped of his crown by parliamentary decree, paving the way for the ascension of his young son, Edward III. Yet, the deposed king's continued existence, even in imprisonment, remained a dangerous rallying point for lingering loyalists. And so, in a grim echo of Despenser's own end, King Edward II met his own horrific fate in Berkeley Castle later that year, almost certainly murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer, though the precise method, a red-hot poker inserted into his anus, if the most lurid accounts are to be believed, remained a whispered horror, a final, brutal severing of his earthly suffering. The triumph of Isabella and Mortimer, however, proved as fragile as the power they had so ruthlessly seized. Their own avarice and the increasingly evident nature of their personal relationship alienated many of the very nobles who had supported their ascent. Roger Mortimer, in particular, began to display the same unchecked ambition and arrogance that had characterized Despenser, accumulating vast lands and wielding excessive power, effectively mirroring the very tyranny they had overthrown. The cycle of violence and vengeance that had consumed Despenser now began to turn its gaze upon his destroyers, demonstrating the inherent instability of a power gained through brutality and maintained by fear. The echoes of Despenser's torment would continue to reverberate, a constant haunting reminder of the dangers of unfettered power and the ease with which vengeance can corrupt its wielders. The grotesque spectacle of Hugh Despenser's execution and the subsequent regicide of Edward II stand as stark, unwavering monuments to an age of profound political instability and the raw, often terrifying exercise of state power. This was not a singular anomaly, a random act of savagery. It was a visceral reflection of an entire society grappling with questions of authority, loyalty, and the terrifying consequences when the bonds of trust between ruler and ruled are utterly severed. The moral inversion at play is profound. The execution, ostensibly an act of justice for a man deemed a traitor and tyrant, simultaneously revealed the deep-seated fear and the boundless capacity for cruelty within the very system that claimed to uphold order. Despenser's suffering became a collective sacrifice, not for a greater good, but for the violent reassertion of a bruised and battered aristocratic order, desperate to purge the stain of perceived royal perversion and restore a semblance of control. We must remember that such events are not merely historical footnotes, but chilling insights into the human condition, the intoxicating allure of absolute power, the devastating vulnerability of the individual before a vengeful mob or a ruthless state, and the enduring human capacity for both profound loyalty and unspeakable barbarism. The narratives of Despenser and Edward II, etched into the collective memory, continue to haunt us, serving as a philosophical warning against the perils of unchecked authority and the horrifying ease with which those who dare to love too openly or to wield power too ruthlessly can be utterly and brutally annihilated. Their story, a lamentable chapter in English history, remains an immortality of cautionary tales, compelling us to reflect on the true cost of power and the fragile nature of justice in a world consumed by vengeance.